On the evening of June 10, 1985, 18-year-old Linda Marie Rutledge attended a party at a residence in the community of Waggoner County near Tulsa, Oklahoma. Linda was a recent high school graduate. At some point during the evening, she left the party with a group of people. Witnesses later told investigators that she departed in a vehicle with several individuals, including a man identified as her former boyfriend. That was the last confirmed time Linda was seen alive. When Linda did not return home and could not be reached, her family reported her missing. The Waggoner County Sheriff's Office began an investigation. Detectives interviewed individuals who had been at the party and those who were believed to have left with her. Early statements suggested there had been tension between Linda and her former boyfriend in the past, but no immediate charges were filed. In the initial phase of the investigation, authorities focused on determining Linda's last known location and retracing her movements after she left the party. Over the following days and weeks, law enforcement conducted searches in areas where she was believed to have traveled. Officers canvassed rural roads, wooded areas, and properties associated with individuals who had been present at the party. Despite these efforts, Linda was not located, and no physical evidence conclusively established what had happened to her. The case transitioned from a missing person investigation to a suspected homicide, although no body was recovered at the time. Investigators gathered witness statements that indicated Linda may have been assaulted on the night she disappeared. Some accounts described an altercation and alleged that she was forced into a vehicle against her will. Law enforcement documented these statements and continued to pursue leads, but inconsistencies among witnesses and the lack of physical evidence complicated the investigation. Detectives also examined the background and alibis of individuals who were with Linda that evening. In the months that followed, search efforts expanded. Authorities searched rural land and bodies of water in Waggoner County. Volunteer searchers assisted at various points. Despite repeated attempts, no remains were discovered. As time passed without new evidence, the case went cold. For years, Linda's disappearance remained unresolved. Her family continued to seek answers, and the Waggoner County Sheriff's Office kept the case file open. Throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, investigators periodically reviewed the case. Changes in personnel within the Sheriff's Office meant that new detectives sometimes revisited the file, re-interviewing witnesses and reviewing prior statements for inconsistencies. Advances in forensic science during this period were limited by the fact that no confirmed physical evidence tied to Linda's disappearance had been recovered. Without a body or definitive crime scene, options for forensic testing were constrained. In 2008, more than 20 decades after Linda's disappearance, new information emerged. Authorities received a tip that directed them to a rural property in Waggoner County. Acting on that information, investigators obtained permission to search the area. During the search, they located human remains buried on the property. The remains were transported for forensic examination. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation and the State Medical Examiner's Office conducted tests to determine identity. Through forensic analysis and comparison with dental records, the remains were identified as those of Linda Marie Rutledge. The discovery confirmed that she had been killed. The medical examiner determined that the manner of death was homicide. Investigators then renewed their focus on identifying and charging the person responsible. The location of the remains became central to the case, as it was associated with an individual who had been present at the party on the night Linda disappeared. Following the identification of the remains, authorities conducted additional interviews and re-examined earlier witness statements. Detectives compared prior accounts with new evidence obtained from the burial site. Investigators also sought to determine whether anyone had knowledge of the burial or had assisted in concealing the crime. The renewed investigation included presenting evidence to a grand jury. In 2009, a Wagoner County grand jury indicted a man identified as Michael Eugene Lee, who had been Linda's former boyfriend, on a charge of first-degree murder. The indictment alleged that he was responsible for her death in 1985. Law enforcement arrested Lee and took him into custody. Prosecutors prepared to present the case in court. During pre-trial proceedings, defense attorneys challenged aspects of the prosecution's evidence, including the reliability of certain witness statements given decades earlier. The court addressed motions related to admissibility of evidence and procedural matters. Because the case involved events from more than 20 years prior, issues concerning faded memories and the availability of witnesses were part of the proceedings. The case proceeded to trial in Wagoner County District Court. Prosecutors presented testimony from witnesses who had been at the party in 1985 and from individuals who claimed to have knowledge of the events surrounding Linda's disappearance. Forensic experts testified regarding the identification of the remains and the findings of the medical examiner. The prosecution argued that the evidence established that Lee had killed Linda and concealed her body on rural property. The defense maintained that the evidence was insufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Attorneys highlighted inconsistencies in witness accounts and the absence of physical evidence linking Lee to the act of killing. They also questioned the credibility of certain witnesses whose statements had changed over time. After deliberation, the jury found Michael Eugene Lee guilty of first-degree murder in connection with Linda Rutledge's death. The court sentenced him to life in prison. The conviction represented the first time anyone had been held criminally responsible for the crime since Linda disappeared in 1985. Following the conviction, appeals were filed challenging the verdict and aspects of the trial. Appellate courts reviewed claims concerning evidentiary rulings and procedural issues. The conviction was ultimately upheld, and the sentence remained in effect. The resolution of Linda Marie Rutledge's case spanned more than 20 years from her disappearance to the recovery of her remains and subsequent prosecution. The investigation involved multiple phases, including initial missing person inquiries, long periods without new evidence, renewed searches based on tips, forensic identification of remains, grand jury proceedings, and a full criminal trial. Law enforcement officials have stated that the case illustrates the importance of continued review of cold cases and the value of information provided by witnesses even years after an event. The discovery of Linda's remains in 2008 was a turning point that transformed a long-standing missing person case into a prosecutable homicide case. Linda Marie Rutledge was 18 years old at the time of her death. Her disappearance and the years without answers had a lasting impact on her family and the community. The eventual recovery of her remains and the conviction of a suspect brought legal closure to a case that had remained unresolved for more than 20 years. The case remains part of the historical record of Wagoner County law enforcement. It demonstrates how persistent investigative work combined with new information and forensic confirmation can lead to charges and conviction even decades after a crime occurs. On July 17, 1988, Kathleen Thomas, age 27, and Rebecca Dowski, age 20, were hiking together in Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. The two women had met earlier that year while working at a restaurant in Virginia Beach. They planned a camping and hiking trip to the park and were last seen alive that afternoon. When they failed to return as scheduled and did not report back to work, concerns were raised. On July 20, 1988, 3 days after they were last seen, a park ranger discovered their bodies in a wooded area off a trail in the Skyland section of Shenandoah National Park. The bodies were located several miles from Skyline Drive. Both women had been bound and had their throats cut. Evidence at the scene indicated that they had been restrained with rope and that the attack had been violent. Personal belongings were found nearby. The National Park Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately began a joint investigation. Because the crime occurred on federal land, the FBI took a leading role. Investigators secured the scene and collected physical evidence, including fibers, rope, and other trace materials. Autopsies confirmed that both victims died from sharp force injuries to the neck. The manner of death was ruled homicide. Authorities interviewed park visitors, employees, and anyone who had been in the vicinity during the relevant time frame. A composite sketch was created based on descriptions from witnesses who reported seeing a man near the victim's campsite around the time they were last seen alive. Law enforcement received numerous tips from across the country, but none led to an arrest. During the early stages of the investigation, attention briefly focused on a drifter named Henry Lee Lucas, who had confessed to numerous murders nationwide during that period. Lucas later claimed responsibility for the Shenandoah killings. However, investigators were unable to corroborate his confession with evidence placing him at the scene. Authorities ultimately determined that Lucas was not responsible for the murders of Thomas and Dowski. In 1996, 8 years after the killings, the FBI announced that it had identified a suspect through DNA evidence. Advances in forensic testing allowed investigators to analyze biological material recovered from the crime scene. The DNA profile was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, known as CODIS. A match was made to a convicted sex offender named Darrell David Rice. Darrell David Rice had been previously investigated in connection with the 1997 abduction of a woman near the Appalachian Trail in Maryland. In that case, Rice had kidnapped a female cyclist at gunpoint and held her captive for several days before releasing her. He was later convicted in federal court and sentenced to prison for that offense. Following the DNA match in the Shenandoah case, Rice was indicted in 2002 on federal murder charges related to the deaths of Thomas and Dowski. Prosecutors alleged that Rice had encountered the two women while they were hiking and had attacked them. The indictment was based largely on the DNA evidence recovered from the crime scene. In 1994, the case went to trial in federal court. During the proceedings, prosecutors presented forensic evidence linking Rice to the scene. Defense attorneys challenged the handling and interpretation of the DNA evidence and argued that the government had not proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. After deliberations, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict, resulting in a mistrial. Federal prosecutors considered retrying the case. However, in 2005, a federal judge dismissed the indictment against Rice, ruling that prosecutors had violated his right to a speedy trial. The dismissal was with prejudice, meaning the charges could not be refiled. As a result, Rice was not convicted for the murders of Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. Rice remained incarcerated on the separate kidnapping conviction. He died in federal prison in 2013 at the age of 58. At the time of his death, the murders of Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski remained officially unsolved in terms of a criminal conviction. The FBI and the National Park Service have continued to list the case as an open homicide investigation. Over the years, investigators have reviewed evidence using updated forensic techniques. Cold case investigators have re-examined physical evidence collected in 1988, including rope fibers and biological samples, to determine whether additional DNA profiles could be developed or compared. The murders of Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski are among several unsolved homicides that occurred in or near Shenandoah National Park and along the Appalachian Trail in the late 1980s and 1990s. However, law enforcement has not publicly confirmed that those cases are connected. Officials have stated that each case is evaluated on its own evidence. The killings prompted increased security awareness within national parks and along hiking trails. Park authorities reviewed policies related to visitor safety, campground monitoring, and communication systems.
The case also led to broader discussions about safety for hikers and campers in remote areas. Family members of Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski have periodically spoken about the impact of the murders and the prolonged legal process. The mistrial and subsequent dismissal of charges in 2005 left the case without a judicial resolution. Law enforcement officials have stated that the case file remains active and that they would evaluate any new evidence or credible tips. In 2019, the FBI renewed public appeals for information regarding the Shenandoah murders, marking the 31st anniversary of the killings. Investigators emphasized that advancements in forensic science could allow for reanalysis of evidence if new material or leads were obtained. Authorities encouraged anyone with information, including individuals who might have been in the park during July 1988, to contact law enforcement. The investigation into the deaths of Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski has involved federal and state agencies over multiple decades. Evidence collection, DNA analysis, grand jury proceedings, a federal trial, and appellate litigation have all been part of the case history. Despite these efforts, no final conviction has been secured for the murders. Kathleen Thomas was 27 years old at the time of her death. Rebecca Dowski was 20 years old. Both were residents of Virginia Beach and had been described by family and friends as close companions who shared plans for travel and outdoor activities. Their trip to Shenandoah National Park in July 1988 was intended as a recreational outing. As of the present, the FBI continues to classify the case as an open investigation. The murders remain part of the official unsolved case listings for violent crimes occurring on federal lands. Authorities have stated that they remain willing to pursue prosecution if new admissible evidence emerges. The deaths of Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski represent one of the most widely known unsolved homicide cases in Shenandoah National Park. The case spans more than 30 decades and reflects the complexities of prosecuting crimes committed in remote locations, especially when legal proceedings do not result in conviction. Law enforcement agencies have maintained that the case is not closed and that investigative review continues.